Han Tuo is the director of a steel factory in northeast China. One day in June 1998, he went to work in the factory as usual, but he ignored several people who greeted him along the way. Because his mind is all thinking about the communication from his superiors, and the issue of laying off workers in the factory. There are more than 10,000 people in the factory, who will retire, who will be diverted, and what should be done after the diversion. These are all pretty tricky questions. Thinking all the way, when he was about to enter the office, a worker stopped him. Han Tuo looked back and knew that this was an old worker in the factory suffering from liver cancer. In order to treat the disease, the family had already been heavily in debt. In the past, the factory could still help him afford some medical expenses, but now the factory itself is on the verge of bankruptcy, and it is so difficult that it can't even pay the employees' wages, let alone the medical expenses. This old employee had been here several times before and told him about the difficult situation in the factory, but this time, Han Tuo obviously felt that something was wrong with him. When he approached, Han Tuo suddenly smelled a strong smell of gasoline. Before Han Tuo had time to ask more questions, the old employee had already walked over quickly, hugged him and shouted, "I'm not going to live anymore, and I won't let you live anymore. If you want to die, everyone will die together." After finishing speaking, the old employee lit the on. The old worker left, and Han Tuo also suffered from burns all over his body. It took 3 years of treatment before he recovered. When he returned, the factory was gone, and more than 10,000 employees were basically laid off. This is just a very common story during the bankruptcy of state-owned enterprises and the mass layoffs in the late 1990s. At that time, the same story was played out almost every day everywhere. Layoff tide. The bankruptcy of state-owned enterprises happened as early as 10 years ago. In 1985, the Shenyang municipal government imposed bankruptcy warnings on 3 collectively owned enterprises that were struggling. After a year of hard work, 2 companies were brought back to life, and 1 company was invalidated. It was officially declared bankrupt on August 3, 1986, becoming the first state-owned enterprise to officially declare bankruptcy after the founding of New China. The company is Shenyang Explosion-Proof Equipment Factory, which prevented the explosion, but failed to prevent its own fate in the end. Its bankruptcy immediately attracted national attention. In 1991, Zhu Rongji, then Vice Premier of the State Council, answered a reporter's question and said, "State-owned enterprises need to reduce the production of unsaleable products and reduce the inventory of long-term products. Now, no matter what, we must solve the problem of inventory backlog of tens of billions of yuan. The current domestic deficit is so big, with so many bank overdrafts, it's already unsustainable, so what's the tax reduction? What's the benefit?" At that time, a large number of state-owned enterprises in China were already struggling to survive. The old system and huge deficits made the government unable to support it, and the wave of layoffs began to spread across the country. In the early 1990s, although many state-owned enterprises in China were on the verge of bankruptcy, they were the fruit of the hard work of several generations of the country, and the country was naturally unwilling to give up any of them. Even on the verge of dying, they will try their best to continue the fate of every state-owned enterprise. From 1993 to 1997, the focus of state-owned enterprise reform was to pilot the establishment of a state-owned enterprise shareholding system. During this period of time, along with the pilot project of the modern enterprise system, we are crossing the river by feeling the stones to find a feasible method. Thousands of state-owned enterprises have participated in the pilot, and the results have been mixed. It was not until around 1995 that we finally concluded a profound truth from practice: it is impossible to save tens of thousands of state-owned enterprises. In 1998, Zhu Rongji was already Prime Minister. He said, "Financial money is mainly used to solve public interest issues, such as infrastructure, public welfare, etc., and should not be messed with projects." A prominent problem in state-owned enterprises at present is the excess of surplus personnel. There are too many, and the burden on enterprises is heavy. Not only is there too much staff, but they are also arguing with each other. The diversion of redundant workers is a direction, a big policy, and a fundamental measure to revitalize state-owned enterprises. This year, Premier Zhu Rongji proposed that state-owned enterprises get out of trouble in 3 years, and this was followed by the largest wave of layoffs in China. Someone said, The reform of state-owned enterprises in 1998 was like a major operation. Without the operation, it would be very difficult for the patients to live a healthy life. Without the reform of this year, the Chinese economy would not have achieved the rapid growth that followed. As a result of the reforms, from 1998 to 2006, state-owned enterprises were cut in half, but profits increased 20-fold. There is a profound truth in this, which shows that at least half of the state-owned enterprises in 1998 were just dawdling. Hard to survive. In a skit in the 1999 Spring Festival Gala, a sentence was shouted, "Our workers have to think for the country, who will be laid off if I am not laid off?" The wave of layoffs has indeed solved the operating difficulties of state-owned enterprises, but the laid-off workers are not so happy. Laid off not only lost their iron rice bowl, but also neglected their living security. The once proud worker status is gone. We must know that in a socialist country, the worker-peasant proletariat is the master of the country. This status is envied by people all over the world. Today, this sense of security and superiority in my heart is gone, and the factory that has been entrusted to generations is gone. This kind of psychological gap is more important than losing my job. People in the countryside can return to the countryside to farm after losing their jobs. No matter how difficult it is, there is a way out. The survival of laid-off workers in the city is much more difficult. Lu Huan's song Start Again sang people's aspirations. In terms of success or failure, life is heroic, but it is just starting all over again. Became the most popular song of the time. As early as the third line construction period, a large number of arsenals in the northeast began to migrate to the central and western regions. Located in Shenyang, a Qinghua machinery factory was built during the period of Zhang Ziulin, and moved south to Henan in 1982, number 126 factory. This factory mainly produces Type 54 rifles and various submachine guns. But in peaceful times, so many guns and ammunition were no longer needed, so the factory turned from military to civilian, and decided to produce various starting guns, tricycles, motorcycles, switches, etc., but the products could not be sold at all. When the factory was in trouble, it had been 6 months since wages were not paid, and now all the workers in the factory have been laid off with an order. Now it is difficult to even eat, so the workers ride bicycles with cloth pockets or sacks to the nearby villages to pick up corn and beans. They say they are picking, but most of them are actually stealing. Because at that time the countryside was also difficult and there was little food. I was so hungry that the whole factory went to the countryside to steal food. The harvester was harvesting beans in the front, and the workers in the factory were picking up the beans from the machine in the back with bags. Seeing that the workers are so poor, I have no choice but to criticize and educate them. After a large number of laid-off workers flowed into the society, they were forced to make a living and chose to engage in low-level social jobs that they had previously looked down upon. They rode tricycles, set up street stalls, cleaned, and competed with migrant workers for living space. In the morning, people often go to pick up the vegetable leaves that fall on the ground in the vegetable market. In the worst case, the whole family made 30 poisonous dumplings on New Year's Eve, and adults and children committed suicide together. Law and order chaos. There have been 3 waves of baby boomers in China, namely around 1950, 1965, and 1980. At this time, the third wave of baby boomers in rural areas grew up one after another. Most of them chose to go out to work after finishing junior high school. At that time, a large number of early established township enterprises closed down, young and middle-aged people could not find a way out, rural public security deteriorated, car bandits rampant, and railway stations in various cities became gathering points for filth. Economic problems caused social problems. From 1993 to 2001, in the wave of layoffs, a total of 70 million people were laid off from state-owned enterprises or collective enterprises across the country. Each laid-off worker was burdened with a heavy family burden. Calculated as a family of 3, it directly affected more than 200 million people across the country. These more than 200 million unemployed people flock to the society, which will bring huge challenges to social security. Guangzhou train station. In the 1990s, both urban and rural areas of China were suffering. Fortunately, the reform and opening up opened up a way out, and the rapid rise of the coastal economic belt saved the entire country. Taking Guangdong province as an example, cities such as Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Dongguan, Zhongshan, Huizhou, and Foshan successively attracted a large amount of foreign capital to build factories. Guizhou, Sichuan, Chongqing, and other places of the young labor force. Since the reform and opening up, Shenzhen, as a first developed special economic zone, has attracted a large number of foreign companies to settle in. Japan Sanyo Electric, Hitachi SEG, Sumitomo Electric, and Imai Corporation have successively established factories in Shenzhen. Shenzhen has ushered in the first wave of rapid development. In the early 1990s, in an ordinary Kaida toy factory in the Shekau industrial zone, workers were paid 350 yuan a month for food and lodging, and overtime was worth more than 200 yuan. At that time, the wages of ordinary workers in the country were less than 100 yuan. Such high wages and high benefits quickly spreading to 10 to hundreds. Soon those laid off workers from all over the country, as well as a large number of unemployed youths in rural areas, after hearing about the high wages and high benefits in Guangdong, set foot on the wave of going south to work. Hundreds of people vying for one position. In fact, the Kaida toy factory in the Shekau industrial zone has high wages and good treatment, but the recruitment of workers is very limited, and they are all introduced by acquaintances, and they have to pay high introduction fees. The major factories in Shenzhen simply cannot accommodate such a labor force. Often after a job post is released, dozens or even hundreds of people will sign up. A large number of people cannot find a job. As city does. So far, China is also facing the most chaotic stage of law and order. In Guangdong at that time, the most terrifying thing was not the boring work and endless overtime. After all, work could still make money and lead a good life. The most terrifying thing was the speeding gang who robbed the society. Speeding gangs are usually committed by two people, one is responsible for driving a motorcycle, and the other is responsible for robbery. They will quickly drive the motorcycle close to passers-by, and the person in the back seat will quickly snatch the passerby's mobile phone and bag. Back then, the speeding gang extremely rampant and impossible to manage due to the speed and number of motorcycles. In Longgang Town, Shenzhen, there are hundreds of car robbery cases every day. At that time, the method of public security was to crack down hard and keep cracking down, but this could not fundamentally solve the problem and change the society. China's problems can only be solved by development. Survive the storm. In 1950, China received 156 industrial projects aided by the Soviet Union. In 1956, the Beijing Electronic Tube Factory, number 774 factory, was established, which was also one of the key aided projects at that time. In 1960, the output value exceeded 300 million yuan, becoming a national key development industry. However, after Japanese color TVs entered China in the 1970s, electronic tube factories in the old industrial chain began to be phased out. In 1986, Beijing Electronic Tube Factory's funds were exhausted, and it had been unable to pay wages for 11 consecutive months. The factory director Zhang Hongbiao checked the financial statements, but found that it was still profitable. After finding out about it from a director of the Ministry of Finance, I found out that state-owned enterprises used the old-fashioned rolling method to calculate, so Zhang Hongbiao reapplied for a new financial report, and only then announced the first loss of Beijing Electronic Tube Factory in 30 years. To the public. Beijing Electron Tube Factory. At that time, China was in the period of transition from a planned economy to a market economy. By 1992, the factory could no longer continue. It was really impossible to continue, so the shareholding system reform began. The newly promoted general manager Wang Dongshen took over the electronic tube factory. Wang Dongshen hired Wang Yanjun, Chen Yanshun, and others led more than 2,600 employees in the factory to raise 6.5 million yuan in seed funds to build a new factory. In 1993, it officially changed its name to Bo Electronics Group. In 1997, Chen Yanshun successfully listed Bo Electronics Group on the B shares of Shenzhen Stock Exchange, raising 300 million Hong Kong dollars at once. The company became rich, and after 1998, the industry was upgraded, and it entered into a high-tech enterprise of electronic information. The successful reform of the Beijing Electronic Tube Factory was a microcosm of the transformation of state-owned enterprises at that time. Only a small part of the transformation was successful, and most of them could only accept the fate of bankruptcy. China has really ushered in a major turning point driven by the rapid development of the coastal areas. Factories in Shenzhen have sprung up one after another, not only behind the demand for talented labor, but also for electricity, roads, transportation, and other aspects. China's power generation mainly relies on coal-fired power generation, and today coal-fired development still accounts for 50%. At this time, the entire nation is high-spirited, and the country is running ahead to grab time. The industrial development in the East has reached a crazy level of power. In 1990, China still has only 600 billion kilowatts of power generation, ranking 4th in the world. In 2000, China rushed to 1.3 trillion kilowatts, ranking 2nd in the world. In 2011, it surpassed the United States and reached 47,000 kilowatts, ranking 1st in the world. In order to ensure power supply, every coal mine is exploited crazily, and a huge price has been paid behind it. 7 of China's top 10 mining disasters were concentrated during this crazy mining period. Countless miners sacrificed their lives to meet China's electricity demand in the special catch-up phase. In terms of infrastructure construction, China has also frantically turned on the acceleration mode. The construction of highways, railways, airports, and bridges has spread all over the country, and it enjoys the reputation of infrastructure madness in the world. The rise of China's industry in the first stage paid a huge price, completed the primitive accumulation of an industrial power, and successfully transformed the state-planned economy into a market economy, pushing the country to make great strides forward. Whether it is the wave of laid-off workers, gang fights, speeding gangs, 10 major mining disasters, crazy infrastructure, etc., they are all unique phenomena in the primitive accumulation period of China's economic development. The industrialization process of every developed country is basically the same. China is struggling after going through a period of painful qualitative change in the previous 30 years, it finally ushered in a new period of development. Looking back at what has happened in China in the past few decades, we seem to see that countless people of the Chinese nation are facing the wind and snow, supporting each other, and launching a sprint to the highest peak in the world. This period of difficult years is the unyielding history of our progress and the epic of our great nation's struggle. Why the society doesn't mention laid-off workers now? They need an explanation. They are waiting for an apology.